Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the small print, and today our guest is Mandy Wiener. Mandy, on this show, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves the way they would like to be introduced. So, who are you, Mandy? What do you care about, and what do you do?
In my mind, I think I'm a semi-professional paddle player, but in reality, I think that's very different. I'm a journalist, I'm an author, I'm a broadcaster, I'm a mum, I'm a wife, and I suppose I'm a storyteller. My profile on Twitter, or X, whatever it's called, and on my website says superhero, but that's a bit delusional as well.
That sounds much more cool than mine. I'm a court jester, so superhero, court jester. There you go, right? And nothing wrong with that. So let's talk about some of your superpowers. You are most known for commentating on what's going on in the world, particularly the world of politics. And as such, the last few weeks in South Africa's history have definitely given you enough content with which to work your craft. Maybe you can start by catching some of the listeners up for this show who might not be South Africans or so familiar with what exactly has gone down in the House of Pretoria, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting time politically in South Africa. We are 30 years into democracy. So we've pretty much had the same government for 30 years. And normally elections take place every 5 years in South Africa. And the ANC, the liberation movement that has been in power for the past 30 years, wins. Outright majority. And going into this election, we knew that it would probably be a little bit different. And indeed, it was a little bit different because for the first time in 30 years, the ANC did not win an outright majority. So they came in at just over 40% of the national vote. And that meant that they needed to find coalition partners to go into government with, which is something that has been done at a city level, at a metro level, at a provincial level in South Africa, but never at a national level. And that means that we are in a realignment of politics in South Africa. It means that everything is upside down because we're in this new territory. And unfortunately, we don't really know how to do it. We haven't got the legislation in place to do it because I think the ANC thought that they would be in power until, as one of their senior leaders said, Jesus arrives. So we're in this new territory trying to work out what the hell is going on. And they're trying to find a deal, and there is currently no deal, but that is evolving so quickly. So there could be a deal within a few hours of us recording this. There could not be. We just don't know. But we are in a very exciting new territory. It's fraught with problems, but it's also fraught with opportunity as well.
Yeah, the way I like to say it is that basically this sort of shakeup is kind of like allows cracks into the solidified present to allow the future in, right? To give us some sort of ambiguity, which will hopefully catalyze action. Because certainly from my perspective, that has been one of the key reasons for growing voter apathy and non-participation in the democratic project. When the outcome seems settled or inevitable, there seems less impetus for us individuals or for even for smaller political parties or for businesses and organizations to do their bit to change that future. So like, what's the point in doing it if we're just going to get the same result? Whereas now suddenly the stakes are incredibly high for even tiny individuals and really small political parties that suddenly have an actual role and actual responsibility to play in the future. Of course, that's always been the case, but these sort of perceptions and memes and norms do kind of trickle down into popular consensus. So if we're believing the story, the ANC will always rule us until Jesus comes back, whenever that is, then we don't act. We're like, oh, well, that's the given, that's the playing field, and we'll operate within that. Whereas when suddenly that is proven to be blatantly false, suddenly it's almost like you're on a field and you've been thrown a ball and now you have to run with it. So if you can take us through some of the characters who might have caught a surprise baby without actually knowing what exactly to do with it. And I certainly see quite a few of them at the moment.
Yeah, I think you're so right on that. Like I do think that we have historically, as you have detailed, seen a very, very high apathy rate amongst South Africans in terms of voter turnout. And that's because everyone just kind of anticipated that the status quo would remain. Going into this elections, the polling was pretty spot on. So I do think that people were aware of how important it was to vote. And there was a big drive to get people out to the polls as well. We still only had a 58% voter turnout, which is much lower than we anticipated. It felt on the ground like it would have been much higher. But I think what we are seeing is that every single vote counted, because a lot of the smaller parties have joined the government of national unity, that there is representation. We have a lot of kingmaker status parties as well. So there are a couple that have caught the baby, that are now going to have to go into government and are going to have to navigate this new way. You spoke about like the kind of emergence of cracks. And we've seen that over the past fortnight or so. But I had this like real genuine hope that we would see this kintsugi art masterpiece with gold lacquer used to piece the shards together. And we would have this emergence of a government of national unity that was not perfect, very much imperfect, but at least it would be something new and something exciting. And that's the potential that we face here. We have had a government of national unity in South Africa before. We had one in 1994 under Nelson Mandela. Things were very different then. The ANC had 62%. Now they have 40%. We were on the knife edge of a potential civil war. The ANC was being magnanimous. Now the ANC is just trying to stay in power. And that was legislated. This is not legislated. So we're trying to find out how to do this thing. And I think that's the big difference about where we are as a country compared to where we were 30 years ago.
Okay, so let's take it a step back and talk about this government of national unity. Very similar to conversations around artificial intelligence, how much of it is artificial, how much of it is intelligent. When it comes to the government of national unity, how much of it is actually a functional government and how much of it is actually unified. I'm really interested in terms of like we advertising this on the front page of all of our newspapers with our wonderful GNU puns and all the rest of it. But just how unified is this government going to be able to be? And just how fixed or watertight are these agreements that are being worked into? Because this is not a legally binding marriage agreement that parties are going into. Rather, it's at least from the layman's perspective, it's a gentleman's agreement. And how gentlemanly and how unified are the gentlemen involved? Because let's face it, is mostly gentlemen going to be going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think Helen Ziller would argue otherwise. So look, the government of national unity, that's how the ANC is spinning it. So they had lots of options about what they could do. They took 14 days. They had 14 days to work out what their options were. There were lots of scenarios. We heard a lot about this idea of a confidence supply agreement. We've heard about a majority coalition, a minority coalition, a super opposition. What the ANC decided to do in the end was this thing called a GNU, a government of national unity. I like to call it a rainbow unicorn coalition draped in rainbow unicorn colors, because it's actually just a coalition. And they're calling it a GNU because it sounds yeah, like it's a good PR spin. Like they've just put a good spin on it, but in reality, it's really just a coalition. And I think that it's important to remember, as I said, like this is not legislated in the way that the 94 GNU was legislated. So they have signed this document, the DA and the ANC, frantically in the final minutes, exchanging different versions, trying to find a deal, because they had to elect a president and they had to elect a speaker within 14 days of the election result being declared. So finally, they got this deal. They signed a statement of intent, but now they're disagreeing over the contents of the statement of intent. Because as you say, it is kind of like a gentleman's agreement. What legal status does it have? Ultimately, the Constitution of South Africa has the overwhelming say on what happens. So the president technically can choose his own cabinet. According to the Constitution, it's up to the president. He can constitute his own cabinet. It's only because of this other agreement that's been signed between the GNU parties that says that there has to be representation of the GNU members, according to the National Assembly. But now they're disagreeing. The ANC and the DA disagree over the contents of this agreement. And that's where we are at the moment, is that they just cannot seem to find one another because they're disagreeing over what they both signed.
And I think the other important point to note is that this disagreement doesn't have to stop until the next election, because basically it's a gentleman's agreement saying, if you vote for us or vote for our president, then we'll reserve some seats for you and we'll work together with you over the course of the next electoral period. But we're not even at the point where we've actually appointed all the ministers yet, and we're already sort of backtracking and reneging on our promises and fighting over details that were supposedly kind of at least sort of agreed to previously. And even after those agreements are made, as you rightfully point out, and we do have a history of doing this, the president could re-elect his men. You know, he could, the Humpty Dumpty can fall down, he can put them together in pieces in all sorts of different configurations multiple times, even in the course of one election period, which really means, like, are these agreements worth the paper they're written on? And what sort of confidence do you have as an analyst that the members of this little gentleman's tea party are going to work together? Or are we going to see protracted upheavals and multiple re-renderings of the puzzle over the next few months? Just how committed are they to actually unifying and governing together?
Look, I think it's all pretty fluid. I think that everyone's trying to find each other at this point. As you mentioned, the last guy, former President Jacob Zuma, used to like to reshuffle his cabinet at midnight quite frequently. I think he did it 5 or 6 times. So look, we are doing things agterstevoor in South Africa, which basically means back to front. What happens in most countries when they try and sort out the coalitions is they take months and months and months to do it. And there's legislation in place to guide the process. Here, because we've never done it before, there was proposed legislation by the Democratic Alliance 2 years ago. It was never passed. And now we find ourselves in the situation where everything is on these severe timelines. There is no timeline now for the cabinet to be appointed. The president can be the minister of everything for months. It's a reasonable time that he needs to appoint a cabinet in. So technically what would have happened in other countries is they would have reached these agreements before the president was elected. So now we have a situation where the DA supported the president to be elected, but now when you get into the minutiae, they don't really like the deal and the arrangement that's on the table. So they need to decide if they're going to walk away or not. Whereas in most other places, they would have sorted that out first before actually having an inauguration and an election. And that's why this is all a bit complicated for us. I mean, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and everywhere else, Israel, it takes months and months and months to sort out these things. And now we try to do it in 14 days. We're ambitious as a people, but I think that was a bit far-fetched.
Yeah, it's a bit ad hoc. It's like we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Or, we find we're building the bridges, we're trying to cross it, which is it does make for interesting times. But what does this say, Mandy, when it comes to business, investor, foreign interest confidence in the South Africa Inc. project at large? We saw stock market fluctuations when the elections came out and all the rest of it, and capital flows that indicated certain votes of confidence towards this project. But what do we see now, and what is the expectation? What is the market expectation? Because quite often when it comes to these sorts of things, those expectations are baked in even before reality hits the fan. What have we done to our let's talk first about our economic reputation and investability view for the rest of the world.
So this has become a real controversial topic when it comes to the government of national unity and the market reacting. So it really has become almost a proxy discussion around race, in fact. And let me try and explain that. So the market and the rand particularly has been reacting quite significantly on the leaks around the GNU talks. So anytime it looks like the government of national unity deal is about to be done and the DA and the ANC find each other, the rand rallies. Whenever there's a leak that says that the DA and the ANC are drifting apart, the rand tanks. And that's because the markets very much are in favor of a DA coalition. And they would prefer that than to a potential coalition with the left-leaning EFF or the very right-leaning MK party of former President Jacob Zuma. Now, that has created this whole other narrative that a lot of people are disputing about why the markets are so volatile and how one political party, being the DA, can have this kind of impact on our currency. So many commentators saying it's simply racist to let the markets dictate. If you look at Economics 101, of course, it will tell you that in order for to have market confidence and for the currency to be buoyed, obviously it means having good policies in place. The DA coalition is seen as an extension of the reformist policies under former President Ramaphosa. It's seen as an improvement of the economy, creation of jobs. And of course, all of that then would mean that there's better investor confidence. We will be able to manage our debt better. We won't have to go to the IMF. We'll be able to create employment. So that's the way that the currency has been reacting. But I think it has to be viewed in the context of this whole other discussion that is taking place here around what it means to make a decision based on the markets. And I think a lot of people are misunderstanding this.
Well, what would you say that misunderstanding is? Can you unpack that a bit more? What are people getting wrong, and how should they perhaps be framing it instead?
I think it works on both sides, because I do think that it's economics. It's basic how the economy functions. In fact, the former finance minister Trevor Manuel came on my show to explain this in such a great way. Because there's this debate about whether we should be placing the people of South Africa at the center of coalition discussions or the markets. And the point that he made was that by placing the markets, you're actually placing the people. Because if you have a stronger currency, if you have a stronger market, if you have more investor confidence, if you get more money flowing into the country, ultimately it improves the lives of South Africans. You're able to finance social grants, you're able to create more jobs and more real employment as well. So it's kind of counterintuitive. But yet there's definitely a strong quarter of people that argue that it's a racist view to allow the markets to dictate, and that the markets will count in a potential EFF coalition, that it will recover, that it will right itself. Yeah. I don't know. We'll leave it to the economists.
Although that's an interesting way of viewing the world, because this idea that markets are separate from people is always quite incredible to me. Whereas markets are representative of the choices and the inequalities within societies. In other words, it's a representation of choices human beings have made and voted for with their capital, and it reflects that, right? It's not something that is imposed upon us. Markets aren't imposed upon people so much as people create markets that represent their in-baked biases, their in-baked inequalities, the systemic issues of society, and all the rest of it. This idea that we can sort of separate the two, the markets have different interests to people, is inaccurate. Yeah. Because the markets represent, yes, at different scales, they do represent an unequal society, but they reflect it back to us because it is the same thing. It's just a map of our choices and our connections with each other, right? And it's always interesting to see people trying to put those against each other rather than trying to untangle it as being part of the same set of problems.
Yeah, and I think it's also going to be viewed through the historical context in South Africa, and this view from the trade union, like the left, from the EFF, that in fact Ramaphosa is manipulated by white monopoly capital, by the Ruperts, that whole kind of like diatribe. I think then this just perpetuates the fact that it's seen as a perpetuation, going into coalition with the DA is seen as a perpetuation of apartheid. And I think what you also need to really appreciate is that I think for a lot of people within the ANC and a lot of people within MK and EFF, the notion of the ANC going into coalition with the DA is really something quite difficult for them to comprehend because of the history of South Africa. The DA, of course, was an opposition party. It was not the National Party, but yet it's still seen as an extension of apartheid in a way. And I think that sometimes people who are in favor of a DA coalition don't fully appreciate just how difficult it is for some people it's just not palatable for a lot of people within the
right? As a betrayal of the promises and the hopes of the electorate. Now, I did want to get your thoughts on that. Like, when we talk about this, we're talking quite broadly, and it's quite easy to see why an EFF supporter or an MK supporter would feel that way, as it's sort of a class-based traitorism that's taken place in terms of the chosen parties. There was a cynical decision to hold on to power rather than hold on to the interests of historical alliances. But what is the view from your perspective? Obviously, you speak to a lot of people from actual core voting bases, from the ANC's own people. Is it seen as a betrayal among ANC voters or not so much? And that's a really interesting question, given how much that voter base fragmented, thanks to the appearance of parties like MK, which already split the base very dramatically into deliberate camps.
I do think it still remains fragmented. I think it depends on any individual's lived experience. So we saw some ANC members early on, when the talks were happening within the ANC and they were debating which way to go, that they were protesting. And here you think of somebody like Kaise Gwale, whose family was involved in, the Maseru invasion. So, you think of somebody who grew up in the ANC, somebody who, understands the principles of the movement, and it really is seen as a betrayal. And then there's other people who are more centrist, the constitutionalists, perhaps, in the ANC, who see that this is the better option. And what's going on now in terms of the disagreements with the DA, it does push the ANC towards a potential coalition with the EFF. And I think this is the real problem that the ANC has, is that it has a crisis of identity. And historically, the ANC has been such a broad church. And that's been the difficulty, is that you do have the RET, very, very extreme quarter within the ANC. And then you've got the more centrist constitutionalists, the reformists under Ramaphosa. And because the ANC is so divided, it really is divided about how to proceed. And I think the government of national unity is just, it's a cover in order to placate both sides, because it gives the appearance of being magnanimous and inviting everyone, but in fact it really is just a coalition. And I think it's an attempt to kind of appease those that would otherwise be very vociferously opposed to a coalition with the DA.
So here we can ask the question in a slightly different way, and that is from your perspective, again, as an analyst, or just from different views that you might have gathered through your guests and your research. What is the general thinking here as to whether the ANC's decisions into going into this particular government of national unity with its particular chosen parties is representative, firstly, of the wishes of its own party members? Is it in the best interests of the ANC voter? And secondly, is it in the best interests of the South African voter? Or is it just in the best interests of the current ANC political class? Which is I think, quite an interesting question to unpack at those different layers.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think that, remember, at the end of the day, the ANC is 40% of the vote. So it's lost the outright majority, which means that it's no longer in power. So I think it's in a position now where it needs to find the way forward. Remember that the ANC has invited all political parties. It hasn't selected the political parties. It's invited everyone to come and join them in the GNU. And that effectively gives them the moral high ground in saying, you're all welcome to come. And if you don't join us, it's on you. So like Action SA have decided not to get involved. They don't want to. The EFF has said thanks, but no thanks, not with the DA. So I think that in a way, the ANC has tried to appease everybody. But is it the right move? I think that they had lots of other options. They could have gone to a minority coalition with the smaller parties, but that makes for a very unstable government. They could have gone into a coalition straight up with the EFF and the MK, but then, again, that takes us on a very constitutional trajectory, considering the MK party wants to pretty much do away with with the constitution and send pregnant teenage girls to Robben Island and all sorts of things like that. We know that the EFF has got some very leftist policies when it comes to land expropriation and other things as well. So is it the correct decision in the interest? I think it probably is the correct decision in the interest of the ANC retaining power and the political elite. But at the same time, the ANC also needs to appreciate the fact that they are going to have to relinquish some of that power. And that's the fallout now, is how much power are they willing to relinquish to the other parties when it comes to cabinet positions, but beyond that, when it comes to policy as well, because now they're going to have to navigate this new way of this, trying to find policy agreements. So you look at something like broad-based Black economic empowerment, where the DA is very opposed to it, and the ANC is obviously in favor. You look at the Bella Bill, which is what language you can be taught in at schools. The DA is very opposed. The ANC is not. You look at our international policy on the Middle East. The DA, I imagine, would not support an approach to the ICJ when it comes to Gaza that the ANC has been driving. So we are going to have to work out how to deal with all of this stuff. And I don't think it's going to be a particularly easy road.
Yeah, and I suppose another way to ask a similar question is, in terms of what the ANC's done now, just looking at it from an inside their house kind of perspective, like they made a choice, and from what I understand, certainly from my perspective, I think I'd agree that it was quite a pragmatic, if slightly cynical, choice to remain in power now. In other words, for the Ramaphosa camp to remain in power now for this cycle. But was that a calculated choice when you look at the longer run goals of the ANC to stay in power for longer? Have they, by trading away some of their perhaps local moral high ground in terms of some of the perceptions people have with the partners that they've chosen, in order to remain in power right now, in order to get Ramaphosa on the throne, probably speaking, have they weakened the chances of getting even into the throne room in future elections for their own electorate? So was this a short-term bet, or was it a more strategic, long-run bet into building a new alliance for the future that will allow the ANC project to continue until Jesus comes, as you want to put it?
I think that it's a short-term decision. I think the reality is we're never going to see the ANC getting over 50% again in an outright majority. I think that we'll never see a situation where the DA gets over 50%. I'm sure those in the DA would disagree with me. But I think what we are seeing now is a realignment of politics in South Africa. I think we could see the ANC has fractured many times in the past. We've seen splinter movements. The MK is a splinter movement. The EFF is a splinter movement. The UDM, we saw COPE historically. So I think we could see more fracturing of the ANC now. I think that whatever they choose, it's going to be very, very difficult, because if you have a scenario where the DA does come and take key portfolios and they're able to demonstrate that they can make real fundamental change and provide service delivery, then that counts against the ANC in the long term. If we carry on the current trajectory with the DA going into the opposition and we just continue with stagnant growth, massive unemployment, huge debt to GDP ratio, all of those issues, I think that will be really problematic for the ANC in the long term. So I'm not sure how this plays out in the long term. I think that we're going to just see a complete realignment, and I think we're in totally new territory.
Yeah, and then what are your perspectives on the parallels between what's happening in South Africa now and what's happening in the US? They obviously had their infamous debate around the same time that we're trying to figure out our future. And certainly from my perspective, when I look at what's going on here, I question the choices as to why parties, both here and there, have fielded the top man candidates they have. Now, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I can't for the life of me figure out why a party like the DA would field someone like John Steenhuisen, who clearly does not have mass market appeal for our market. The same could be said with Ramaphosa himself, who only appeals to a small segment of the electorate, not even enough to really get half of his potential voting base to the polls. This is not a populist candidate by any way, shape, or form, who was going up against populist candidates in the more sort of fringe and splinter breakaway opposition parties, very similar to what you see in the US. Why, for the life of anyone, would either of those parties field either of those geriatric old men? They're clearly not in the best interests of capturing the biggest market of the US electorate either, but they clearly have some more sorts of probably inward cynical goals for fielding the status quo rather than fielding something the market actually wants. It's like being an ice cream shop and not selling ice cream. Like, why are parties putting out these particular candidates who so obviously do not appeal to the palate of the people they're supposed to be representing?
I don't know. Girls should just run the world, man. Like, really, I don't get it. Like, I agree with you on so many levels there. I think we tend to have like this very parochial view in South Africa that things are much worse here, and that everything is always terrible. But remember, half of the globe has gone to the polls this year. And when you look at that Trump-Biden debate and how firstly incoherent and moggy Biden was, and what a liar Trump is, and those are the two best candidates in the whole of the US. It does make you wonder. And then you look at South Africa. So you mentioned Ramaphosa and popularity. I think Afrobarometer did a poll which showed that he was actually really popular. He does have populist appeal, but he's not populist in the way that Jacob Zuma is. In fact, Zuma is very much a Trumpian figure in South African politics. And I think that's why MK did so well, and gave the ANC a big hiding, because Zuma is such a Trumpian figure and there was that populist appeal. And it was seen as a big fu to the ANC, really. John Steenhuisen would argue, I imagine, that the growth of the DA has risen under his leadership. So the DA went up by 1 percentage point.
That's like saying, Trump's popularity grew and he was running against Hillary, or the other way around.
Yeah.
That's more
Politicians always say that, right?
And you claiming the victory. I don't know about growth. That I would have to challenge that point.
Totally, but that's exactly what John argues, because I've asked him this question. So, he would say that the black support for the DA grew in this election, and he managed to grow the support, albeit by 1%, when somebody like Mmusi Maimane saw a loss, I think, of like 4 or 5%. So that would be the argument, right? However, I totally take your point on the fact that, are these the right people? I think the problem that the DA has in reality is this image of being anti-black and pro-white. And I think that's what's so unpalatable for so many people who struggle to comprehend how there could be this GNU, this coalition, because of the way in which black leaders within the party have been treated historically. From Mmusi Maimane to Lindiwe Mazibuko, Phumzile Van Dam, Mbali Ntuli, Bongani Baloyi. The DA has very much hemorrhaged black leaders. They do have a black chief whip in Siviwe Gwarube, but I think that unfortunately for the DA, they have not done a good job of polishing that image, not just the image, but also in reality in terms of true transformation. But yeah, I mean, I think we have a problem with politics in South Africa generally. I think that the kind of people that we elect as leaders in this country, the bar is very, very low. We have a lot of people in South Africa who are in positions in the National Assembly because it is sheltered employment. We see a lot of councillors, and we see a lot of assassinations, political hits being carried out because there is so much at stake for councillors, because they get an income, and they're able to get security and all of that. But then you look at, for example, the bar in order to get into the National Assembly, and you have somebody like an impeached judge president who is now the official leader of the opposition in Parliament, even though he was impeached, and he could now sit on the JSE, which is the body that impeached him. You have an impeached public protector. You have someone like Zizi Kodwa, who 2 weeks ago was charged with corruption, and he had to resign as a minister, being sworn in as a member of parliament. The bar to being an MP is just that you haven't received a criminal record in the last 5 years, and that you can manage your finances, and you are a South African citizen. Like, that's wild.
That is wild, but I think you touched on a really interesting point when it comes to South African politics, as opposed to some of the other, let's face it, they're all chaotic, flawed democracies, and like politicians are not to be trusted anywhere. Like by very dint of like standing for election, most of these people are disqualifying themselves based on the kind of candidates that want to move forward, as Tolkien picked up like over a century ago. But I think that one of the missing links in South African the society and the government is actually not even at the elected level. As much as all these characters, we can roll our eyes at them and shake our fists at the sky about, they're a symptom of something else. But where we're missing compared to other countries is a functional civil service. In so many democracies, even where politics is a chaos show, like the US is absolutely no better than us. It still has even stranger puppets in charge and all the rest of it. The actual civil service is still functional in many of those places, whereas ours isn't. You spoke about the sort of hits and the fact that you get your job in civil service, in the actual execution branch of government, through increasingly precarious and interesting means. And we don't have that sort of functional department, the people who actually do the work, who keep the lights on. We know this. We know that service delivery is probably one of the biggest issues facing South African society. We can largely get by and make a plan because we are very resilient, as much as we hate that word. As a people, we know how to look after ourselves. We can do these things, but the things we can't fix are the things that are public goods that require a civil service to deliver. Road networks, water networks, power grids. You can generate as much solar as you like if you can't connect it to the grid. We need those sort of functional, that glue, that sinew that holds society together. The unelected arms of government are perhaps our biggest weakness at the moment. And as much as we focus our attention on the elected characters and their flaws and their noise and all the rest of it, it's almost irrelevant compared to the day-to-day struggles of actual South Africans. And I think that this is a symptom that a lot of people have, a frustration of the political system, and that it doesn't seem to matter who you vote for, who's in charge. The actual functional side of government is dysfunctional. And that's the part we as citizens struggle the most to engage with, because we don't get to elect those people. We have to just deal with the system that's there. I'm not sure what your perspective is on that, and if we are going to see, or if there's any sort of rays of hope as to how the newly elected governments of national unity or disunity, whatever you want to call it, is going to have any sorts of functional impact on the actual functioning of society at a public sector level.
So I think that the reason that other countries can take 18 months to sort out a coalition government is because the civil service functions. It continues to function in the absence of of political heads, right? And I think that's what we struggle with here. So one of the sticking points that we're seeing currently between the ANC and the DA is over the appointment of director generals in departments, which are ultimately the most senior civil servant. And the reason that is such a contentious point is because historically, the DA has challenged the ANC in court, in a court case, around this policy of cadre deployment. And what that effectively means is that the ANC makes political appointments when it comes to the civil service. And the DA is arguing that it should be a meritocratic process, and that it shouldn't be simply those who are cadres of the movement, who are ANC deployees, but rather the most qualified. However, what the DA is being criticized of doing now is saying, well, wherever we get a ministerial portfolio, we want to be able to appoint our own DGs. And many people are arguing, well, the ANC is arguing that's just reverse cadre deployment, right? And I think that is the big problem that we have in South Africa, is we do not have a meritocracy when it comes to the civil service. And we need to professionalize the civil service. So there is a big move to try and professionalize the civil service. I don't think it's happening fast enough. I think that it's really necessary. Because if you look at the Auditor General's report, if you look at what is happening at a municipal level, you can see the failures in service delivery. And a lot of that is administrative. And that is because you don't have the right people with the right experience, the right knowledge, the right skills, the right capabilities to be able to actually run municipalities and deliver services. We also have deep entrenched corruption and tender fraud, and that is often helped along the way by corrupt individuals who are there because they are deployees of the political institution, right? So I think that ultimately it's a culture of politics in South Africa. And I think that is something that and we have an opportunity now because we are redefining our politics. We have an opportunity to really make sure that we prioritize meritocracy and a professional civil service. What we also have in South Africa that's important to highlight is a very strong civil society.
Yes.
Strong civil society, very strong media, very strong Chapter 9 institutions, a very, very strong judiciary, all of that stuff. And what we see is that in every single instance where government has failed, it has been the civil society organizations and the media and the judiciary that has stepped into the breach to hold government to account. And I think that now more than ever, with a weakened opposition, we are going to have to be more vigilant than ever as well to make sure that we do hold power to account.
Yeah, I suppose that's the question. How do you depoliticize that so-called sort of fifth estate, that civil servant class in society? How do you depoliticize it at such a point in South Africa's history where it has been so politicized from the dawn of democracy? It was sort of baked into the ANC's whole model for redeveloping society was to politicize the civil service. But how do you then go about depoliticizing it going forward?
I think you also have to make it attractive to people to want to actually do it. Because at the moment, people don't really want those jobs. They'd much rather go into the private sector, than go and become a government employee. And I think people are
doing a natural separation there, right? Sorry to interrupt, but just like you've got this, like the good people don't want the jobs in the civil service. By good, I mean qualified. Like let's even park morality for a second. Like just functionally qualified, capable people don't want to work in the civil service because they can do better in the private sector. And at the same time, you've kind of got the people that are in the civil service cannot get a job in the private sector that will pay them as well. There's no one who values them as much as the they'll get there. So you have this natural separating effect where it just gets worse in the civil service and gets better in the private sector. And that's well and good if you can make a plan, but it doesn't ever solve the problem. Like how do you reverse that sort of cycle where the separating effect just gets further and further?
And I wish I knew the answer to that, right? I would be an excellent politician. But I think it's about making the public service attractive. And making people want to contribute. I think Ramaphosa did really well on this when he came into power with the New Dawn and Tumamina, Send Me. Everybody wanted to step up and go into government and make a difference. And that kind of fell flat. I don't think it really was as effective. What I'm encouraged by now, and I think maybe the answer to this is what we're seeing in terms of public-private partnerships. And the successes there, where there is a big move from the private sector through Operation Vulindlela, which sits in the presidency, to uplift the public service through the private sector. So we're seeing a lot of secondment. We're seeing a lot of collaboration on key projects, whether it is on the rail networks, the corridors, the ports, whether it is on crime, corruption, power generation. We're seeing a lot of collaboration with these different work streams between the private sector and the public sector. And I think maybe that's the way to do it, is to rather look at how the private sector can lift as it rises. So there isn't this deep kind of rift between the two, and where we're able to improve the quality and the offering of the public sector through the private sector.
Yeah, and I think you're getting to the point, which is probably the way to kind of conclude this, is that, like unprecedented change like this, even though it comes across in terms of like future studies terminology as a black jellyfish. It's something we knew it was happening. ANC decline was it a long running trend? We all knew eventually they wouldn't be able to hold their outright majority, but we all kind of just ignored it until it happened, right? So we kind of got to that point, but nevertheless we are at that point, and that point has forced change upon us, and change allows us to question the unquestionable and to challenge things that were taken just for granted forever. It suddenly makes the impossible possible again. And that's the kind of sense that I certainly get among my corporate clients, around people that I talk to. There's the sense that the possible is possible again, or the impossible has become possible. And that means we can try new things, we can have new conversations, because suddenly not only was the impossible of the ANC losing its majority a possibility, it was also impossible even a few years ago to think about the DA and ANC coalescing over really anything, even in a very flawed and very sort of shall we call it a situationship kind of relationship that wasn't even really a possibility people engaged with, and now it's here. So I think that's the interesting thing. There's a whole lot of impossibilities that suddenly become possible, and these sort of cracks that the light gets in, we need to sort of keep them open. So keep that Overton, all those different little Overton windows open while they are open, while we are still sort of struggling to sort of get our footing on where we are right now. We have to embrace that whole set of new possibilities that's suddenly available to us, and we see that in the sort of market confidence, whatever sort of subtext is behind that. We do see this sort of switch towards, maybe that is possible. Maybe we can participate. And I don't know if you've also sort of sensed that among conversations around this part of the world.
So I'm really optimistic about where we are, because I do think that it does take us into a place where anything could happen. South Africa is alive with possibilities, because things are changing. I think that we were in a very stagnant place. I think that we needed, I love the black jellyfish term, because we knew we were going to get here, right? I think it's the sign of a maturing democracy. The fact that this happens to liberation parties that come into power. Historically, we've seen that tracking. It was always going to happen at some point, that the ANC was going to get less than 50%. And I think that we are here now, and I think it's important to embrace it. I think we're learning. It was always going to be a tough road. I think we don't know what we're doing entirely, but I do think that there is great opportunity. I think there's going to be difficulty. I think we're going to have a fight on our hands. Government's going to disagree over everything, but I think it's also going to force politicians to compromise and to find each other, and this requires political maturity. And I think it will really be a test for our political leaders in order to navigate their way through it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point to leave it. Let's leave it with a bit of optimism, because these conversations can too often be derailed back into the mess of the problem.
I'm always optimistic.
Yeah. Let's focus on the possible. There's a whole range of new possibilities suddenly available to grasping politicians, to aspirant sort of civil service leaders, and to the public sector and the private sector too, both. So let's try out some of those ideas before the sort of the present closes in on the future again, and we kind of locked into a new holding pattern reality. Let's push this needle as far as we can, whichever direction we're most keen to see it move, I suppose.
It's exciting. Yeah, I always say I am optimistic. I'm not Pollyanna. I definitely appreciate the issues and what's confronting us, but I do think it's interesting. And hey, we don't have Trump or Biden as potential presidential candidates.
We're already one up on America. That's excellent. So Mandy, where can people find you if they want to continue the conversation, if they want to book you to talk for them, to write for them, to work for them, whatever you're doing these days? Where do you want to be found?
So I do a show every day on 702 and Cape Talk from 12 to 1. So you can tune in there. I do keynotes. So you can get hold of me on my website, mandywiener.com. And I am on LinkedIn, Facebook, X, Insta, everywhere, trying to make sense of what's going on at the moment.
Excellent. So let's continue the conversation here, all with Mandy, and thank you for tuning in. That's right, I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement, and that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting, and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy, and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate. So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.